It's just a science project.
Silent breed is people!
You know, a doctor friend once said the same thing to me. Frankenstein was his name.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
That sounds like something out of science fiction.
Please explain to me the scientific nature of the whammy.
We live in a spaceship, dear.
So? Yes, science!
Program complete. Enter when ready.
Hello and welcome to episode 241 of Science on Top for Sunday the 4th of September 2016. I'm Ed Brown and I'm joined by Dr. Shane Joseph.
Hello.
Penny Dumsday.
Hello.
And Lucas Randall.
Hello.
And coming up on the show, we've got a few Australian wildlife stories, the songs birds sing to their eggs, and a new hope for the Tasmanian devil. And we'll be talking about aliens. But first, let's talk about Otzi, the spectacularly well-preserved human found in 1991 in the Italian Alps, and he was wearing a leather coat and a fur hat. Possibly, that was all the rage 5,000 years ago. And now new genetic analysis has found clues as to why he rocked that look. Shane, I can see how DNA can reveal what he was wearing. I'm intrigued as to how it can explain why he was wearing it, though.
Yeah, you could possibly say that it's a bit of a stretch, but then again, we're not anthropologists. And I think anthropologists sometimes do have to make kind of deductive leaps in some ways. You know, they'll look at something very small and say, well, okay, there's the reason that this exists, or there's a reason that this culture possibly behaved this way. It's interesting. Like it's an interesting thought experiment at the very least. So what they've found is that Otzi, well, they've made a deduction from where he was living, what sort of clothes he was wearing, what sort of food he ate, because they apparently found they found, I think from memory, the remains of a meal in his stomach that possibly suggested that he wasn't exactly very healthy at the time. And he was quite old for the time too. Like he was 40 years old, which is quite old for however long he lived for 5,000 years ago. He probably would have been quite ancient as far as the standards went.
So he would have been considered by his cavemen, sort of younger caveman peers as being kind of out of fashion by then, surely. Possibly
too, yeah. So possibly what he was wearing was not actually in vogue, as all these websites have been actually suggesting. So the important thing is, first of all, he was wearing a kind of a goatskin pair of pants that they found similar pants in, I think, an older pair of pants, not with the body attached to it, in Switzerland, which they've made the leap there and said, okay, maybe this was something that they wore these sort of pants in this, and a similar sort of environment like the Alps. So maybe that was something that they wore because of its utility. Maybe, it kept people warm. Maybe it was very flexible. Who knows? But his coat. So I think they were asking the question of, what was his sort of status in society? Was he wearing like a very regal kind of thing? Or was it something very utilitarian? And it turns out that the animal skins that he used for his coat came from not just different animals, but different species. And it looks like it was kind of a haphazardly kind of woven thing. So it's possible that this was just a very old coat that he wore all the time, and he repaired it many, many times, and it was just there because it was useful. So again, it's a bit of it's hard to sometimes as an empirical scientist to look at this and go, you can't make that leap. But it's actually not that much of a leap in some ways. It's, and as I said, it's an interesting kind of thought experiment as to, looking at evidence like this and trying to figure out how people lived. And I quite like it. So, and the fact that they use genetic analysis to look at haplotypes, mitochondrial haplotypes, to discover what kind of animals were in this coat.
Yeah,
and I think looking at the time frame, so he's, correct me if I'm wrong, he's kind of from like 3000 BC. That's kind of the rough time
that's
frame?
about right. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
So
3,300.
At that point, there's surely there's a lot of other indications of a lot of trade going on between tribes and different people from different areas. It seems to me the most obvious explanation is, okay, things were traded. I've got these cool goat skin shoes. I like your coat. Thanks. This coat's actually made from, 4 different types of goat. Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I like that. It just seems more, more likely to me than I don't know. It seems an equally reasonable explanation.
But that doesn't negate the first explanation.
No, not at all. I'm not saying it does. It seems, why wouldn't it just be a thing of trade rather than something that's...
Well, also apparently, so the leggings, for example, were crafted apparently from goat leather, which, as I said, is possibly indicates that it was a sort of leather that people in this area and this time used quite extensively. But the important thing is that it was from a domesticated goat and it wasn't from a hunted animal.
Okay.
Right. That is interesting.
Yeah. So basically, it's they've got this picture in there of this man and his society as being sort of a half farming, half hunting society. And that makes sense too, because it probably would have been sort of the transition from, hunter-gathering to farming. But in this case, these leggings are from domesticated goats. So it does seem to suggest that, well, this was a very well-established kind of thing that they did, So
it also strikes me that it's a single data set.
Of course,
and I mean, if you have a look at even in a city like Melbourne, how various different areas have their own sort of sartorial style. You get your hipsters in Northcote and that sort of thing. But I'm just thinking, when you consider how spread out modern humans were at that time, it just boggles my mind to think that we can look at one person and say, well, that's how a lot of them probably would have dressed, or how maybe he's just the lone fur coat guy.
He might have been the village crazy who decided to wear, to wear a raggedy coat. Who knows? But I suppose that's all they've got. Well, that's not. That's all they've got.
Material
you work with what you have, and it seems to suggest that if you assume that he was a typical man of his time, then you kind of have to go with the assumption that, okay, these are the typical clothes that people wore. And they might hopefully they find another mummy somewhere in the Alps that proves that wrong. But
well, that'll be interesting. We can hope. Okay, Penny, let's get to some of our Australian wildlife stories now. And in particular, the zebra finch. And a new study published in the journal Science has found that the mothers sing songs to their eggs, basically telling the little embryos what the weather's like. And most surprisingly, they listen and adjust their own development accordingly. That's awesome.
It's amazing. And I'm sure bird aficionados will be laughing at me that I've never, ever, ever heard of this before. So when the parent birds sing a particular song to their eggs, it actually, like Ed said, it affects the way they develop, their weight, the number of offspring they have and things like that. So, I mean, I've heard that, human babies, for example, will recognise their mother's voice when they're born, or a particular song or something if they've heard it again and again. But I've never heard of anything like this before. So that fact alone just blew my mind. But what this study was about the response to temperature. So what happened is this was done on captive birds living in an aviary. The microphones were placed in 125 nests. And this was based on the observation that the birds, the zebra finches, sometimes sing a specific song when they're alone with the eggs. So they're not singing it spontaneously, alone by themselves. They're not singing it to another finch. They're really singing in the presence of eggs that are about to hatch. And they only sang this song when the weather was warm. And what they found was that compared to... I'm going to have to say this carefully because it's sort of complex, even though it's not. So compared to birds, so chicks that had been sung to, and that they played recordings of this hot weather song, that grew up in a hotter nest, tended to weigh less than in a cooler nest. So if you heard the song and the weather was hot, you weighed less. But if the chicks didn't hear the song, they were heavier. So I'm guessing that maybe less weight provides some advantage in hot weather.
Well, yeah, because these are desert birds, really.
Yeah.
They live in the deserts where, keeping your temperature right is really important.
But what's really fascinating is that the finches, the female ones that had heard the song and then grown smaller, had up to 6 fledglings, whereas the ones that didn't had only 1 or 2. So hearing this call in hot weather and the response that the chick gets with the combination of the call and the hot weather made it more productive, which is evolutionary, like ding, 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 ding.
Yeah.
I just thought this was absolutely fascinating for so many reasons. I feel like I'm not fully doing it justice, but just the thought that a behaviour like singing can not only alter the sort of, the phenotype of the next generation and how big the finches tend to be, but also its reproductive success. It's amazing. And I would love to know what's going on. I mean, I suppose it's triggering some kind of hormonal response or... Anyway.
It's interesting also because there is research to show that as climate change is warming the planet, we are seeing wild bird populations slowly shrinking. Whether that's a correlation or causation, hard to tell. But this adds weight to that causation theory that it could be that things are warming up so that basically having less chicks hatch as a result, maybe. I don't know. Or more to the point that the chicks are smaller and therefore less able to survive in the world. I don't know.
I have no idea. And the other point was made that this behaviour functions within the finch's normal temperature range. It's not kind of, doesn't matter how hot it gets, they can just sing a bit more.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
I liked the in this news article on BBC, where they're quoting Dr. Mariette, where she says she first noticed the rhythmic high-pitched calls while making field recordings during her PhD. I was looking at how the parents talk to each other and coordinate parental care, and that's when I noticed that sometimes when a parent was by itself in the nest, incubating the egg, it produced quite a different call. I wondered, are they talking to their eggs? That is very cool.
It is really cool. Imagine asking for the money.
The grant application.
Yeah.
Well, when I've been listening to them, it sounds like they're singing a different one. Can I just record them and listen to them and analyse it? Because I reckon they could be singing to their eggs. That would be an interesting grant application.
It would be.
All right. Lucas, let's move on to our furry Tasmanian friends. And I'm not talking about the Launceston skeptics, but we've talked a lot on the show about the deadly facial tumour that's plaguing the Tasmanian devils. And that's a serious thing, given that these carnivorous marsupials are the main predator in Tasmania. Apart from humans, obviously. But there's finally some good news, as it seems they might be slowly developing a resistance to this cancer. It's extraordinary.
It is, for multiple reasons. So we talked about this back in episode 228, where we talked about one of the key problems that the devils are facing is their lack of genetic diversity. So obviously in order for a species to have robust defences against pathogens and things like this, it needs some quite a lot of genetic diversity in order to pick through evolution what mixes of those genes, give it some advantage. So if you've got effectively a whole lot of almost clones with very little genetic diversity, it means that something that comes along that they're vulnerable to can wipe out a whole population. And this is applicable to things like bananas, for example, the Cavendish bananas that we eat,
yes.
Which are effectively all clones. So there's whenever there's an event, some sort of blight that affects those crops, it pretty much wipes them all out unless they can be protected by the farmers. So, it's a big issue. So that's been the reason why some projects have spawned to take some devils and put them into effectively a controlled situation where they can be protected from this disease, because the concern was that all the wild devils might be wiped out, and then once that happens, they wanted the ability to be able to reintroduce devils into the wild. Now, this finding, which is really interesting, is showing that in as little as 6 to 8 generations, which is all that they have to work with since this disease was first identified back in the 90s, the devils do actually seem to be evolving changes in their genome. This disease has wiped out something like 80% of devils on the Tasmanian in the Tasmanian land. So I was going to say on the mainland of Tasmania, but that's kind of silly.
The island of Tasmania.
Yes, thank you. Then I felt like I was being dismissive of Tasmania. Oh God. But yeah, I mean, 80% is a significant impact to to the species in terms of loss. So obviously the fear is, okay, we're really looking down the barrel of having to do something about this. So back in episode 228, we also discovered, or we talked about a discovery. We didn't discover anything. We just talked about it. We talked about a discovery of potentially a different population of devils who, based on some analysis of their scat, basically appear to have some slightly different genetic makeup. And that was exciting at the time because it meant that, hey, maybe there is some genetic diversity and maybe this will actually save the devils. But this new this new study has found that there are some populations of devils that are showing an increasing resistance to this cancer, which is actually a transmissible cancer, and this tumour disease that develops on their face. And it's meaning that the devils who seem to have developed this resistance, of course, are, by very nature of the disease, becoming a greater percentage of the overall population. That's pretty much what selection is, natural selection is. So it's just really interesting that it's happening in such a short time frame. And this might be partly because of the devastating effects of the disease are actually putting a selective pressure, a very strong selective pressure on the ones that have got, this ability to fight off the disease. But it does also raise some other interesting questions for our projects of putting these other devils aside to reintroduce into the wild, because now if we were to introduce some of those devils that have been put aside back into the wild, they would actually undermine the selective pressures that are taking place, increasing the resistance across the whole population, because you're reintroducing individuals into those populations who don't have those protective genes. So it kind of means that perhaps the best thing to do right now, along with continual study, of course, is to just leave them alone and not go playing around with the populations.
Isn't that just typical? Yeah. It's always that you get the case where as soon as we intervene to stop some crisis, we end up making things worse.
And this is, I guess,
Sometimes.
something that's we've discussed a little bit in other episodes as well, is the various efforts to introduce a new way of controlling something sometimes have gone awry. The other thing to think about as well is that this could be a two-pronged thing that we're seeing here. It might not be just simply that the devils are developing a resistance to it. We also know that diseases like this will continue to evolve in their host population, and it might well be that the disease is evolving to the point that it doesn't kill its hosts before it has a chance to pass on to other hosts. So the disease might effectively be becoming less fatal, or certainly not in the time frames. And that also will be important, because what they're seeing with the devil populations who are infected with this disease is normally devils will produce 3 litters in their lifetime, but the devils who are most affected by this are the sexually mature, healthy, otherwise very healthy devils, the ones that would be producing the litters. So it's decreased the average litter rate down to 1 per generation. And of course, that's a real problem. So if the disease is becoming less fatal so that it can increase its rates of transmission, and at the same time devils are developing more robust ways of coping with the disease, it might mean that this kind of becomes less of an issue over time, which is a really good thing.
Yeah, let's hope so. I mean, it's one that you're just going to have to sort of wait and see, really, then, if this is just nature taking its course and correcting for that disease. It'll be really interesting to see how it goes.
Yeah, but of course, I think, as with everything, it's certainly worthwhile continuing with those projects to keep other devils aside, because we don't know what's going to happen yet. But obviously, the word of caution right now is let's not go into reintroducing those individuals into the populations right now. Let's wait and see what happens here.
Yeah. This is probably going to be something that's going to be solved with a multi-prong approach, where you have maybe some kept in isolation, you have the introduction of the new species, and you have natural resistance developing, and probably something else, like some sort of a medication or something like that. It's a really fascinating topic, and as I say, it's really important when you consider these are now the apex predator in Tasmania after the thylacine was wiped out. So
And I think you said in the intro that that we're already seeing the impact of that. The loss of devils means that feral cats are becoming really the apex predator, and that's a real problem because they're significantly less discriminate in what they target, other than the devils. So yeah, this obviously feral cats are potentially a big problem for the ecosystem.
Certainly is.
Yeah.
Now let's have a look at a bacterial story, Shane. Do you want to tell us about the supernova ash discovered in the fossils created by bacteria? That's all of those. I understand all the words. I do not understand that sentence.
I have to confess, I felt the same about it, Ed, so I'm listening.
I'm not entirely sure I get it all up myself because
all right, good. You come here for the expert commentary.
And I read it and I was like, oh, this bacteria stuff is hard.
Okay. Supernovas will create lots of things, but one thing they do create that we can measure and that we know are only caused in supernovas is a isotope of iron called iron-60. Now, they have found iron-60 in magnetic crystals that were formed by magnetobacteria about 2.8 million years ago. Now, this is really cool because they've found evidence of a supernova that happened, they think, from a star that was about 325 light years away from us, that obviously, blew its top and then spurted out all these different debris onto our Earth for about 800,000 years, which is kind of, scary when you think about the length of time that we were being pelted by this stuff. Or I say we, but the Earth was. And that the bacteria in the Pacific Ocean, or at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, incorporated this into their makeup and created magnetic crystals that we are now detecting. So it's sort of... What's also really kind of cool about this, as an aside, is that this time frame kind of coincides with a mass extinction on Earth of things like mollusks, marine snails, and things like that. So, as one of the researchers says, it could be a coincidence, but it would be a really weird one. Like, it would be the chances of this happening are probably at the same time, and the supernova not having an effect on Earth is kind of hard to believe.
Yeah.
So yeah,
It's still pretty cool that we can not only detect remnants of a supernova here on Earth, but we can also work out that was probably about 325 light years away, maybe a bit more.
Yeah.
Things like that. It's pretty awesome.
Yeah, and I'm not exactly sure how they did that, to be honest, because, again, that's not my field. But I just love the fact that, that they can discover the astronomical remnants of these isotopes in bacterial fossils, or the things that bacteria left behind.
I think the 325 light year estimate is based on the quantities of iron-60 within the sample set, because as it disperses out from the supernova, the further away, less and less of it would actually reach any one point.
Oh, of course, because of the way it disperses. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
And while we're talking about space stuff, Lucas, apparently scientists at SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, have found aliens. I read this on the internet, so I assume it's true. Can you tell us any more about these little green men and women?
Yeah, they're not.
Yeah.
It's
the spoiler alert. Let's just go home now. Yeah.
This is obviously an ongoing theme on this show, that because we read a lot of science news to prepare for the show, we read a lot of science news that's not very good preparing for the show. And to be fair, a couple of outlets retrospectively covered this in a much more responsible manner, particularly pointing out that the initial reports that went what's the word?
Viral?
Yeah, that's the word. Thank you. There's initial viral, social media tweeting, "Oh my God, aliens!" Were not really well thought out, and this is just, as I say, it's an ongoing theme. But the problems here are many. Basically, there was a signal that was detected by a Russian team of scientists, and they made an announcement about it, saying, "Hey, we detected this signal." They didn't. As far as I can tell, that the Russian astronomers didn't draw the conclusion that therefore aliens. They just released this finding that they presented this now, and this is potentially quite a reasonable. This is just my thoughts on the issue. I've not read this, but it seems quite reasonable that they would do that because it's a good way to get other people to do follow-up observations. Say, hey, we detected this signal. We've looked at it again and not detected a signal. Can other people look at it with other instruments and see if they detect the signal? Because then it will be interesting. I think that's reasonable. The media then go, "Oh my God!" Headlines such as "Not a drill. SETI is investigating a possible extraterrestrial signal from deep space from the observer." And they went further to say, if the signal is truly from an alien world, it's one far more advanced than ours. Where did that come from? Oh my God! They've got radio. Come on.
Well, no,
the bacteria too. My God, they've got bacteria with radio. It's amazing. It's a miracle. I'm sorry.
I suspect the more advanced thing comes from the fact that they would need a hell of a lot of energy to send this signal.
If it were that far away.
If it were a signal.
And if it were
potentially,
a signal, yeah.
But look, I've not read on how strong this signal spike was, but what I have read is the responses by some SETI scientist in the US who has sort of pulled this apart. Eric Kopila, I apologise if I'm saying a name wrong. He's from Berkeley SETI, which is the SETI that everyone's sort of familiar with. And he kind of did a point-by-point response to this, where he said, well, yeah, not really interesting, to be honest. To quote him, I looked over the presentation. I was unimpressed. It's really, he goes on from there and explains why he wasn't impressed, but he also pointed out that this sort of signal has been fairly routinely picked up by the SETI at Home project, which analyses millions of data points by seeing it out for idle CPUs sitting in the homes of people who are happy to donate that time. And these things are part of their criteria is to look for these spikes, and they find them fairly routinely. And then what they do is they look further in the data set to see whether these spikes are repeatable. So what I will do is I'll point out these points that Coppella explained, which are the type of signals that would be interesting to us. So he says, we believe a signal when it is persistent. It appears in the same spot in the sky in multiple observation. It only comes from one spot in the sky. We observe the target and we re-observe the target and the signal is still there. And things that add to believability, its frequency or period of delay does not correspond to known interference, which is frequently what we've picked up in the past. And its Doppler drift rate indicates that it's exactly frequency stable in the frame of the centre of mass of the solar system. Its properties, bandwidth, chirp rate, and encoding indicate intelligent origin, because there are a lot of things in the sky that send out radio. It's why we have radio telescopes. So there's also a hell of a lot of things orbiting our planet that, strangely enough, communicate with Earth with radio. So this signal was, he said, quite characteristic of a satellite passing in front of the frame of reference of the telescope, which is what they usually are. So, basically, the media has just gone wild with aliens.
Well, it reminds me a lot of the WOW signal, which was detection made in, I think, the 70s by the Arecibo telescope, I think. It was just a spike in radio detections. A one-off freak event, no explanation. The only thing that's significant about it is that one of the guys looking at it went, wow, and wrote that next to the signal on the radar.
With an exclamation mark, I think, from memory.
Yeah. And I don't think, and now he can't remember why he wrote it or what was going on at the time.
He was.
Wasn't it? But have they not? But they still haven't figured out what that was, have they? Or they don't.
No, but that's exactly the point. That was an errant signal that was interesting in that it stood out from the background noise, but it was never seen again in that spot. It was there were no follow-up observations of it whatsoever. It could have been from so many different things, but that detection with the Arecibo telescope in Chile was only an indication that there's a signal. It didn't tell us really anything else about the signal. And that's what has to happen in order to move on to the next step. And the thing is, of all of the possible explanations of it, it takes follow-up observations in order to rule them out. And that's why, part of the gold standard of this is to see whether it can be detected again and it's coming from the same place again. because that's what you would expect. If an alien civilization was intentionally sending out some kind of beacon signal, they're not likely to do it just for a few minutes and go, well, see if anyone got that message. What would be the point? You'd need it to be either on a repeatable schedule, which would be potentially indicative of intelligence, although there's things in the universe that do things on a very repeatable signal. We actually use things that do that to help us figure out distances in the universe. You would also expect that the signal itself would have some components which were not the sort of things you would see in nature. Pulsars, for example, they're quite identifiable because the signal is so reproducible. So if you're going to do it, you'd send some kind of bit stream or whatever, or some kind of pulse pattern that was like, okay, this is definitely, you hear Morse code, someone tapping out Morse code, that's very, it's very unlikely that's just going to be the cooling of the tin roof, because it's the same pattern again and again and again and again. So I don't think there's any point in saying anything more.
But obviously, if we do get another signal from the exact same spot, repeatable and everything, then that will be newsworthy, and we'll talk about it then.
But it will be interesting so far as, okay, we've moved on to the next step of eliminating a whole lot of other things. So, and that's what would need to occur.
So while we're talking about space news that's been reported wildly that might not be as exciting or all that it's cracked up to be, I think we have to talk about the EMdrive, which is groan-inducing. So this is a theoretical engine that's been proposed that could somehow propel a craft without actually pushing against something and using that action-reaction method that all conventional rockets use. And Lucas, do you want to take it from there? Because this is now past peer review, whatever that means.
Yeah, okay. So a bit of background on this. So one of the problems that we have with space travel is if you want to use something that produces thrust, you typically need to carry a lot of fuel. Otherwise, you can only produce a very small amount of thrust. So a good example of this would be ion drives. They produce thrust, and it's thrust that's produced continuously for a long period of time, as long as you've got fuel. And it doesn't require a great deal of fuel, which makes it really, really cool for sending probes to places. But it's not really, really cool for sending things somewhere really, really quickly, at least within the local sort of system. You could use an ion drive to send stuff to other stars, because over the period of their journey, they would consistently accelerate for the period of their journey. So they get faster and faster and faster and faster. Then, of course, you've got the problem that when they reach where they're going, they can't stop and they fly past really, really fast. So, this is one of those things that's a real, eureka thing for the space industry, is coming up with some kind of propulsion method that doesn't require a huge amount of mass of material to use as fuel. So, I have to admit, the science of this is beyond me. Let's just say it becomes quantum, and then when that happens, it's hard to follow it. But suffice to say, the whole point of this is that you can have a fuel source that produces an outcome, which in this case is thrust, although it's very in the model that was built, because it's not just theoretical. They built a model for this. The model that was built produces a small amount of thrust, but it doesn't use up fuel in the conventional sense. All it requires is electricity. Now, there's ways of getting electricity from space. So that's, especially if you've got a nearby star, which is handy. So if you're going to use it in a local sense, that could be really, really handy. But what it means is, if you look at the rules of the laws of thermodynamics, basically you can't you can't produce thrust from a closed system, i.e. what happens when you produce thrust is you have thrust going out the back and it exerts the same opposite force on the vessel itself. So I guess the easiest analogy is the old, why can't you just set up a fan on a sailing boat and blow the sail and have it move forward? Because the source of the thrust, in this case the fan, is within a closed system. It can't produce an impact beyond the system because there's an equal and opposite force pushing back from the sail. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So that's really the problem with this drive, and it's the thing that there's been a great deal of speculation as to what we're actually seeing. Originally, because this kind of goes back quite a number of years, originally when the first results were released for that, there was a whole lot of engineering and scientific response, which was, okay, there must be something that's not being observed here, which is cancelling it out. And maybe the thrust that's being observed is actually a thermodynamic reaction, particularly because the first experiments done on this were not done in a vacuum. So they're saying maybe the thing is heating up, and that's creating convection currents, and that's what you're actually recording as thrust. That has now, and what has actually happened since then, and why this is in the news now, is NASA took this thing and they stuck it in a vacuum cylinder, a vacuum chamber, and they tested it, and they still found a small amount of thrust. So they said, well, it's significantly less likely to be convection currents because, well, there's no air. There's very, very little to heat up and be moving around in a vacuum by definition. So that's likely not it. So that's all that's actually happened. They've just ruled out one thing. I think, based on this model and the small amount of thrust that's been observed from this model, I think that I think this based on what I've read. This is not my own brilliant summation. That it appears to be far more likely that the small amount of thrust that's being observed is either erroneous or is countered by something equally as small that they've not found yet.
Yeah.
And I think that's the latter is most likely the case. So is this a massive, this is going to change everything event? I don't think so. It might. Maybe there's more to it, but we just don't understand. And this is, I guess, where the caveat of quantum comes into play, because this drive, the mechanism by which this drives action is currently being described or proposed as a description does involve quantum effects and well, I'm not even going to get into it because it's a bit beyond me. But if that's the case, then we know that the quantum world works in very strange and unpredictable ways. So maybe that's the case. But either way, we're saying if everything we've tested and understand about this drive is correct, we're still way more than 50 years from being able to utilise it in any meaningful way, and it would have to be scaled up in very much the same scales. Like, what I'm saying is it would have to hold true that the same amount of energy and output scales up, and that's not known yet. So, has everything changed? Have the laws of thermodynamics been broken? No.
I think that the takeaway basically is that this is a proposal, an experiment, a model that's been made that, if true, will fundamentally change how we understand physics at the moment.
Yes.
And has now been published or has been accepted to be published in a peer-reviewed journal. I forget which journal that was. Was that Nature or? The Journal of Propulsion and Power. Sorry. There's an old. Is it? I don't know if it's yet an idiom or just a rule of thumb. An adage.
An adage, perhaps, that the length of the name of the journal is indicative of how it's inversely indicative of how trustworthy it is. So I don't know this journal, and I'm not saying that's the case. Please don't.
Is that why you think the Public Library of Science is just PLOS?
But then again, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences is actually a very prestigious journal which has a very stupid name that can be abbreviated to penis. So, it's... Yeah, so that doesn't always hold true, Lucas. But
no, and as I said,
the
abbreviation is
they're
what
not
matters.
Always true.
Anyway, but I think what we need to remember is just being approved for peer-reviewed publication doesn't mean it's a thing.
Oh no,
it just means that
there have been many things that have been peer-reviewed and published that have turned out to be absolutely false. So we don't know. Yeah, but I mean, it is one step further towards legitimacy. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's true. And it's similar, in fact, to the SETI signal that we were just talking about. This is something that's been accepted for publication for discussion amongst the scientific community.
Yeah.
It's not like someone's commissioned it. NASA said, right, this is a thing. We're going to build a probe with taxpayers' money. We're going to send it to Jupiter or whatever. It's not like that. It's a theory that we're going to discuss.
I think the reason people are placing so much emphasis on the fact that it has passed peer review is because, to be honest, a lot of the science news we get these days hasn't.
It's true.
And it's a big thing to actually pass peer review. It really shouldn't be, but it shouldn't be as big as it is. But it seems to be because the world we live in nowadays, news travels very, very quickly, and and even if it's not necessarily news. So I did welcome this news with a bit of optimism, in that at least it has been accepted by a bunch of peers as opposed to some dude on the internet scratching his legs and grunting, "We're gonna go to the stars," So hopefully,
but what has been accepted in this case is simply that NASA has got involved and they've ruled out one of the possible explanations.
Yes. And who knows, down the track, they might find that, as you said, there's some other explanation that accounts for that, and that would be disappointing, but probably more realistic.
I would say that's likely to happen.
Yeah.
But,
it would be disappointing, but also how science works. So, yay.
Exactly.
Science.
Yeah.
We'll keep an eye on it, and if something does happen, great. We'll talk about it. But I think for now, that's our show. For more information about the stories we talked about, check out the website, scienceontop.com/241. Leave us a comment or talk to us on social media. And don't forget, you can email us, feedback@scienceontop.com. And there's always iTunes. Go and leave a review on that. Say something nice about us. Shane, Lucas, Penny, thank you all as always.
Thanks, Ed.
And thank you everyone for listening. We'll be back again next week, putting science on top of the agenda. Join us then.
If you dip a glass in the ocean and you look at it and your glass has no fish, what's your conclusion? Is your conclusion that the ocean doesn't have any fish in it? Or is your conclusion that's an awfully big ocean and I didn't sample very much of it with my glass? 50 years of exploration of the cosmic oceans is minuscule. We haven't looked yet. We've hardly begun to search. We ought to do a much better job of searching before we draw any extraordinary conclusions.